Hello and welcome to DSR's Words Matter, our weekly therapy session with Dr. Norm Ornstein, our national therapist. How do we feel today, Norm?
Upbeat. Yeah,
We,
right.
come on. That's great. A sarcastic therapist. Oh, you
Yeah.
look great.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know why you would be feeling upbeat. Give me.
Well, look,
Let's
I mean,
start.
there are
Give
lots
me
of
one
reasons.
good reason to feel upbeat right now.
We've got this fantastic ceasefire. The Iranians have agreed that the tolls that they'll take from the tankers coming through the Strait of Hormuz can be paid in Trump coins. Uh,
You
yeah,
know, let's talk about that a second. Uh, if Iran is getting paid in crypto,
yeah,
I really want to follow the money. Anything that happens that is a deal with the Trump administration that gets paid in crypto, I want to follow the money because I believe that any deal that Donald Trump or Steve Witkoff or Howard Lutnick or any of these characters does has a little something something on the side. And I mean, tell me, say, David, lie down on the couch. You're a little paranoid. This would never happen in America.
Well, I think you're wrong in one sense, David. A little
Ah.
something on the side? It's a lot of something on the side.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think that did you see the story that Ken Vogel had in the New York Times last night
no.
about the almost $30 million kindness of their heart donation of steel by
Yes.
ArcelorMittal
Yeah.
to the Trump ballroom, which was followed weeks later by Trump giving them a break on their trade status.
You know, the Supreme Court has whittled away over the last decade plus at the whole notion of what constitutes bribery. But they did say bribery with a public official is when you take something and get something directly in return, when there is a quid pro quo. How else would you define this deal other than a quid pro quo? Give me 35 million and I will give you tariff relief and put more money in your pockets. It's the 35 million
Norm,
is truly small potatoes compared to the billions he's raking
Norm,
in.
Norm, you naive little buttercup. Um, the Supreme Court said something like what you said, but what they really said was there has to be an explicit
Yeah,
quid pro
yeah, you're
quo.
right.
And an explicit quid pro quo means that somebody has got to say, preferably in writing or with some evidence, that this exchange is taking place for that reason. And what they left the door open to was just this, where I give you something and I get something in return, but it's all wink and a nod. And there's a lot of winking and nodding going on in this administration.
Yeah, but I will bet you, David, that at some point, maybe years down the road, when some intrepid researcher is going through the emails of and texts of Donald Trump from his various smartphones that are being tapped on a regular basis by every foreign intelligence service, there will be one from Donald Trump saying, "I've got an idea. You give me the steel, I'll give you the tariffs."
Yeah, yeah, but
It'll be
that's
too
why.
late then. It's true.
But that's why he's got Witkoff and Witkoff's kids,
Yeah.
and a friend of mine was visiting a big conference, had to do with I think Saudi Arabia in Florida, and who's there? The little Trumpies, the little Witkoffies, the little Lutnicks. They're like lounge lizards, you know, um, hanging out, sort of getting their cut. And of course, we here in the United States of America are such naive dopes, and maybe look, maybe I'm overreacting. Here's the reality: Washington is awash in dark money. We've got people on the Supreme Court who were put there because big donors wanted them to rule a certain way. We've got people in Congress who are becoming millionaires day in and day out, doing insider trading day in and day out. Nobody will do anything about it. People in the administration, it's the entire city, and it's not all explicit. It's like you go, like sometimes we do, you go to the Four Seasons hotel, the breakfast room there, which is kind of the company cafeteria, and somebody walks up to your table and says, "Hey, nice to see you, Bob. When you get out of the administration, we could give you a 7-figure job." And Bob goes, "Oh, that's great." And then a week later, he goes, "Bob, that 7-figure job, that's just out there for you. But there's something I think you need to address. Let me tell you where we are on this." And there's no quid pro quo, but Bob wants the 7-figure job. And so, he puts his thumb on the scale, things go a certain way. That's the whole. Washington's a just big, giant cash machine. And everybody else is like, oh my goodness, that could be corrupt. Everything is corrupt here, Norm.
Bob Kaiser, who was one of the great Washington Post journalists before the Washington Post became nothing better than a dish rag, wrote a book some years ago called So Damn Much Money, which was really built around the story of Jack Abramoff, who ended up going to jail, although he's now back apparently doing the same kinds of things. And it was just about this, only mostly what it involved was Abraham going into a senator's office and saying to the receptionist, "You are terrific. I'm keeping my eye on you. And instead of the $22,000 you're making here, I can give you $80,000. And then when he would bring in some unsavory person, client of his, the receptionist would say, "Go right into the office, sir." That was just one small part of it. It's now broadened absolutely dramatically. But, Howard Lutnick, or Nutlick, as I like to call him, now is all over social media from television appearances he made a few months ago, saying the fourth quarter of 2025 is going to have the greatest growth in the history of the country. 4% growth they were predicting. It's now in at 0.5%. And my response to that was, well, the economy has been booming, the Lutnick family economy, because of the grifting that he's doing. But,
yeah,
I'm going to pivot.
Don't pivot away from Howard Lutnick. Let me say one thing about Howard Lutnick and then pivot away. I got to know Howard Lutnick a little bit.
Yeah.
And I'd like to share this experience with you because a long time ago, when I'd come out of the Clinton administration, I'd come out of Kissinger Associates where I'd worked. Okay, it's a mistake, I admit it. But when I came out of those things, I got involved because I do national security stuff with putting together a scenario about terrorist threats on Wall Street. And in a dark twist, that this scenario took place on the top floor. Scenario exercise took place on the top floor of the World Trade Center, and it was sponsored by Cantor Fitzgerald. Cantor Fitzgerald was the firm that was run by Howard Lutnick, is now run by his kids. Gesundheit. And of the people who attended this, talking about these terror threats, 20 or 30 of them apparently were killed a year or two later when 9/11 took place. And I exchanged a couple of emails at the time with Howard Lutnick. I didn't know him well, but it was, I felt bad, so blah, blah, blah. And he seemed to be devastated by what had happened. Fast forward a little bit, he promised everybody who were the families of the survivors that they would get some of the billions and billions of dollars he was making. And then he stiffed them all. He stiffed them all. And I'm not saying he stiffed everybody who was involved. I don't want to get into a legal hassle, but certainly there was a controversy over him making promises that didn't get fulfilled. And to me, having lived through that whole thing, that was especially ugly. Then, of course, Howard Lutnick, gets a house for, what did he pay? $10?
$10.
Next door to Jeffrey Epstein, who he said he didn't know, but then it turns out he visited his island. And now he's on the witness list. I think they're going to go and they're going to interview him. Now, is he going to tell the truth? No. Is he going to lie? Yeah. But I'm just saying that everything about these people that makes us uncomfortable or makes us angry has been known to the world for decades.
Yeah. Well, those were all qualifications for Trump picking him for his cabinet. Instead of what would be a normal situation, anybody with a scintilla of honesty and integrity looking at Howard Lutnick's background would have said, you're not going anywhere near a position of public trust. Instead, it was, oh boy, this is just the kind of guy we want. He has proven to be as big a lickspittle to Trump as any of the other cabinet members, and the competition is stiff. And we also know that he let his sons take over Cantor Fitzgerald and has been basically getting government contracts steered over to them so that the Lutnick family can make more money. He is just vile.
Don Jr. and Eric are where? They're in the Middle East selling people on the drone company they just invested in. And, Witkoff's son is out there and on the edge of some of the negotiations with the Russians and so forth. It's just amazing to me that this isn't top news story every single day. But I was talking to a fancy journalist type, and they were saying, I can't find journalists who know how to do arithmetic.
Yeah, I think that's unfortunately absolutely right. Now, the pivot I was going to make is you had mentioned insider trading. Look at what we've seen since this war loomed and began to take place. Hours before either presidential announcements or actions, somebody has been making investments and making hundreds of millions of dollars. And let's note that, as we always should with insider trading, it's not just somebody taking information they're not supposed to have and use and making money. The money they're making leaves victims all over the place. If you sell a stock short, somebody who didn't and had that stock is going to get screwed. If you make that ton of money, it's not coming from nowhere. It's coming from other investors who don't know. Now, the Securities and Exchange Commission should be able to have the information to know precisely who has made these trades to make hundreds of millions of dollars in the last couple of weeks. And are they doing anything about it? Of course not.
Oh, Normie. You innocent little buttercup. You think this SEC or this DOJ, which is getting rid of the people that actually track white collar crime and is pardoning the people who are guilty of white collar crime, and just today did a deal with some criminal who was involved in ripping people off, in which they said, no, you don't have to pay back the people. This administration is actually, kind of doing the opposite of what an administration should do. It's putting more criminals in the street. It's putting more fraudsters out there. It's giving them free reign. It's saying, we're not going to track you. This is not the golden age for America, Trump promised, but it is the golden age for fraud.
But of course, they promised a fraud task force. But
it's what they didn't say is that it's pro-fraud.
Yeah, it's absolutely. It's much of this very, very likely involves people very close to Donald Trump. And then we have, speaking of the Justice Department, the acting Attorney General saying on camera about Donald Trump, the president, I love you, sir. which is just what you want. Of course, perhaps it's even more dark than we know, but that's the world we're living in.
Well, no, but they have to say that.
Yeah.
Because and this is the big story of the week, which we haven't even gotten to yet, because we're subtle this way, and we don't wear our feelings on our sleeves, is that Donald Trump on Tuesday morning at 8:06 a.m. revealed to the world that he is a maniac on the scale of the worst maniacs who ever lived on the planet. He threatened to eliminate a civilization which has existed for 7,000 years, and that's conservatively counting. There have been cities and towns in Iran for 100,000 years. He threatened to eliminate it, and this is the most destructive, hideous promise ever made, or assertion ever made, particularly given the cause, by an American president. And that's saying something, since we do have some genocide in our past. And I think with this, the whole notion that Trump isn't out of his mind has to go away. I mean, the guy is broken.
I did a piece out yesterday in the Contrarian called "Break the Glass." And the idea was that, we've always seen, all have seen these little red metal things on the walls that say, "In case of fire, break glass." And my point was, the new fire is the 25th Amendment. We need to break the glass and do something, because we are being governed by a maniac.
Yeah, but how?
Well,
the cabinet's not going to turn him, do what the 25th Amendment requires, right?
I did a little history of the 25th Amendment, and it is an extraordinarily high bar in Section 4. You have to have the vice president and half the cabinet sign a document saying the president is temporarily removed and the vice president becomes the acting president. And the president can, in writing, say, "No, I contest this." And then Congress has to get it in 48 hours and rule within 21 days. And if 2/3 of them vote that it's not valid, he goes, or don't vote that it's a valid removal, he goes back in. High bar. My point was...
High bar?
Yeah.
It's more likely that Donald Trump ends up in a tutu as the prima ballerina of the American Ballet Theater than that ever happened.
Well, if Jeffrey Epstein were still around, he might end up in a tutu, but that's another story.
Wait, that's a video I don't want to see.
That's right. I don't presume to believe that it will happen. The reason I put it out there is that everybody should know that we have an administration deliberately structured by Donald Trump to make sure that nobody in his inner or outer circle will say, "You can't do that," or "No," or even "Yes, sir," and then not do some crazy thing that he asks.
Well, that's why you have so many Howard Lutnicks there.
Exactly.
It's a Confederacy of Nutlicks.
Yes. And it's one thing if you're just dealing with normal Donald Trump, which is malignant narcissist or malignant narcissistic psychopath. But if you're dealing with malignant narcissistic psychopath with advanced dementia, it's that much worse. And the point is, this needs to be raised on a regular basis to show that everything Trump says, when he puts it out there on True Social, there's nobody around him saying, "Sir, I lost your phone. I'm sorry, we can't find it." There is nobody saying, "You really can't do this," much less if he did order a new bomber to be given the name Enola Gay to nuke Iran, nobody to stop him. with one caveat here, which is a reason to feel slightly less pessimistic. Pete Hegseth, who is almost as big a danger to global peace, decency, and the safety of America, much less American soldiers, not only lied about the 6 of our brave military who were killed at a base in Kuwait by saying it was completely fortified, but it was one of these drones that could sneak around everything. And the survivors are saying, no, that's not the case. And I have a feeling that Hegseth will try and court-martial them all. But he did a press conference with one of the top military figures, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, next to him. A reporter asked a question of the general. Hegseth tried to cut him off and yelled at the questioner, move on to the next question. And the general said, no, I'll answer it. It may well be that if somebody in the military at a top level was ordered to commit a war crime, that individual or many of them would say no. But then again, Hegseth has stacked the military with people who will do anything. So,
well, I have to say, a lot of reports came out earlier this week from people I know who are former high-level general officers, admirals within the Pentagon or the military structure of this country, who said they were starting to get responses from their friends, or starting to hear that some senior admirals, some senior generals were saying, no, I'm uncomfortable with this civilian target. I'm uncomfortable with this for that reason, including, according to one of the reports I got, the commanding admiral of CENTCOM, who is overseeing these actions. Now, having said that, obviously Hegseth is trying to create, through a series of purges, a group that will go along with what he wants. Although frankly, my thought has all along been that their goal was to get people who would be okay with deploying troops in the streets in the U.S. as opposed to committing war crimes overseas. But there is other shady stuff here. And yesterday, there's an interesting bit on the BBC, not here, because we don't cover it here, that asked a lot of questions about the rescue mission of that F-15, where for some reason there was a colonel in the back seat of an F-15, which is a weapons officer slot, normally a much lower ranking officer, which suggests, that there was something going on sensitive in this mission. And indeed, the F-15 was pretty deep into Iran and not that far from Isfahan, where nuclear fissile material is stored. And the rescue mission, so-called rescue mission, involved a very substantial number of special operations soldiers and several aircraft which were destroyed on the ground by us, that suggested different kind of mission altogether. And, the BBC was at least saying, here are some questions that need to be answered. U.S. media hasn't really picked up on that yet. But whether or not they were laying the groundwork for going in and getting the enriched uranium, or they were involved in some other kind of mission or not, because these guys lie all the time, we have no idea what's going on.
Absolutely. I say this about many of the officials, but I think it's a general statement about everybody in this administration. Every word out of their mouths, including a and the, is a lie. And speaking of all of that, let's talk about JD Vance for a few minutes.
Yes, okay.
JD Vance, among his many tasks in the anti-fraud task force, over in Hungary, days before the election, an election in which the Russians are up to their eyeballs in trying to alter the outcome, an election involving a prime minister who has directly been sending to Moscow the most sensitive discussions taking place in the European Union, And JD Vance is there both praising him and urging his election, and then decrying foreign interference in elections, and spreading the base lie by Orban that Zelensky was trying to go after him, go after Orban. Only a small part of the vile activities by J.D. Vance. You know, we have seen some pretty awful vice presidents in the past. In our lifetimes, we had Spiro Agnew, who, after all, was approached in the White House with news that he was going to be indicted in Maryland for taking massive bribes when he'd been governor, and was forced to resign from that office. Spiro Agnew was like a paragon of integrity compared to J.D. Vance.
And Spiro Agnew was convicted of tax fraud.
Yeah.
So let's be, let's be clear.
Yeah.
I think Vance is repugnant, but I do have a wish for J.D. Vance, and it's one of the few areas where our desires overlap. I really hope J.D. Vance is the Republican nominee in 2028. He is so disgusting. I hear your dog barking in the background.
Yeah.
I would vote for your dog over J.D. Vance in a heartbeat.
My dog would make a great president, and your dog could be the vice president.
Thank you.
Under those circumstances.
There's a ticket.
I'd actually support Vivek Ramaswamy, who has taken an almost sure thing in Ohio, running for governor, and turned it into one where he is now way behind. He'd be a perfect Republican nominee.
Well, they've got a lot to choose from. Norm, there are two stories I want to get to before we end. One of them you're not aware of. I'm pretty sure you're not aware of it. You know why? Because I just checked Blue Sky, and it's happening sort of as we speak here. In an effort for the administration brilliantly planned effort to distract from the Epstein files, apparently Melania Trump just stood up at the White House while making remarks and said, "The lies linking me with Jeffrey Epstein need to end today. I've never been friends with Epstein. I never had a relationship with Epstein or his accomplice, Maxwell. My email reply to Maxwell cannot be categorized as anything more than casual correspondence." Now, Norm, you are an insider of Washington. Is this the way to make the Epstein story go away?
I hope she keeps doing it over and over again. And, this is, we have talked about this before, but the Chico Marx defense, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? It's not lying eyes, just me or your own eyes. It's right out of Duck Soup. And people think it was Groucho, and people mischaracterize it, but that's what it is. And of course, your own eyes show lots of pictures of a young and gorgeous Melania Trump side by side with Jeffrey Epstein. And we know that she came over as a model, including befriending a guy who somehow mysteriously died just before he was about to give evidence about his relationship with Trump.
As everyone does.
Yeah.
And now she said this publicly, which is, by the way, I think Gary Hart's still alive. Somebody she should have called Gary Hart, who said to the press, "If you think I'm having an affair, prove it." And they said, "Okay."
They said, "Go." They proved it. He said, "Go ahead, follow me," and they followed him.
And they followed him and proved it. And this is just Melania saying, "Okay, America, have at it." And of course, they're going to prove it. But it was not, Norm, the weirdest story of the week.
What was, David?
Well, let me tell you, Norm. The weirdest story of the week was that apparently the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Elbridge Colby, son of former CIA director and former friend of mine, he's now the late William Colby, had a meeting with a representative of the Vatican and said, on good authority, the Vatican's got to go along with us. We're the U.S. military. We can do anything we want, and threatens the possibility, and this is going to be lost on a lot of our listeners, perhaps, of an Avignon papacy, which is a result of is a reference to the Great Schism that I remember from when I was a kid, and it's just an astonishing thing to me that somebody at a high level in the Pentagon thought that it was a good idea to threaten the Pope.
Nice Vatican you've got there. Would be a shame if something happened to it. Exactly. But let's talk about the administration response to this. The first was, it's a lie, it never happened. That was followed by, well, there was a meeting, but it didn't go the way you thought it did. The next was, well, there was a meeting and there were words exchanged, but it wasn't Eldridge Colby. It was somebody else. So that's where we are now.
Right. And we weren't referring to the Great Schism. We were actually referring to the 30 Years' War.
Yeah,
but that's a whole other. It's a crazy town, Norm. It's just a crazy, crazy town. And I am so glad that each and every week I get to turn to you for wisdom and insight, humor, solace, and rest assured, I will be back next week, as will all of our listeners who have turned our weekly conversations into their favorite podcasts that we do here at the DSR Network, which I think, is a sign of their inner genius, and also maybe they need a stiff drink, because what is it that makes them come back for more of this?
Before we go, David, I just want to reference one other thing that happened this week. Actually, I want to talk about two. We're going to extend a little bit. The one was that apparently a disgruntled employee just burned down an enormous factory in Ontario, California, of paper products, destroying 3% of the toilet paper for California. And I just want to say, it's, they've wiped out a good share of the toilet paper. Now, let me move on. And I want to talk about another action that Trump appears to be taking today, which is destroying the Forest Service and the Park Service, basically ending research done by the Forest Service, cutting its personnel, eviscerating it, and doing the same with the Park Police. And I mention this because, of course, a lot of this is all these cuts taking place so they can fund a $1.5 trillion military. But think about the consequences. You take out the research that's done on the forests. Not only are we going to have more horrible diseases that hit trees and remove a good share of the trees in the country that are used for multiple purposes, means a lot weaker trees. It means the lumber supply is going to be down, which means housing costs are going to go significantly up. And it means more forest fires, larger spread of forest fires, more people and wildlife killed, more neighborhoods destroyed. And that's the tip of the iceberg, the melting iceberg that we have to deal with in terms of the devastation being caused. You cut the heart out of the Park Service. And I remember when Newt Gingrich shut down the government during the Clinton administration, as you remember very well, because you didn't get paid for a significant period of time, among other things. And they shut down.
Yeah. And I was acting Undersecretary of Commerce during the shutdown, but two of them. And so there were 2,400 people in the International Trade Administration, and there were like 8 of us who were deemed essential. And so we'd show up at this giant building, which until the Pentagon was built was the biggest building in Washington, and there was nobody there.
Yeah.
And I was like presiding over a kingdom of nothing. But anyway, sorry.
But the point is that shutdown meant that the national parks were closed over a prime holiday period. You have been, as I am sure, as I have, to many of the magnificent national parks in Utah. And you go down to those parks, and it's not just the parks, it's the hotels, the restaurants, the gift shops, all of the commerce surrounding it. So the first people to scream at Newt for doing the shutdown and saying, you got to get this back, were the representatives from Utah who saw what the consequences were. So they're destroying the economy. They're creating misery. They're creating more inflation, higher costs, more mayhem on a daily and hourly basis. And that's the best you can say about these maniacs and lickspittles who are now running our federal government out of Washington from Congress and this administration. And that's a good note on which to end.
It is. It is. And it's completely consistent with everything else they're doing, shutting down vital cancer research, or even this past week, as the Artemis astronauts did provide us with really uplifting stories, and the president tried to pile in on that to get some credit for it. Uh, the administration put forward a budget that cut by half the science budget of NASA. So, wherever you look, when there's an opportunity to do something the wrong way that hurts the United States and the people of the United States, they do it. Unfortunately for them, we're here every week to point it out. And we will do that again next week. But for now, thank you, Norm. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Bye bye.